Hello, I am Andrew Capetta, the Manager of Collection and Exhibition Programs at the Cleveland Museum of Art, and I'd like to welcome you to the John and Helen Collis Lecture, Viewing St. Catherine's Monastery at Sinai. While other guests are joining us, use this time to familiarize yourself with the chat interface. To join the chat, just enter your name, or really any name that you prefer, and click to agree to the terms of service and the privacy policy. We encourage you to use the chat to ask questions during the program at any time. They will be addressed in the last portion of tonight's program. And if you'd like, and I see people already doing this, let us know where you're coming from. We have people from all across the world, which is a really wonderful thing to see. If you're having trouble hearing us, make sure the volume on your device is turned up and that the video is unmuted. You can find the volume control to the right of the video's play bar. The color blue indicates the volume level. If the video stops playing, just refresh your browser and ensure that the video is not paused by pressing the triangular play button. If you happen to hear an echo, make sure the video is not playing in one tab on your device. If it is playing in multiple locations, there may be an echo. If you have any other additional questions or issues, please contact us at virtualevents@clevelandart.org. Below the screen is a list of web resources that relate to this afternoon's program, so feel free to take a look at those now or later. And lastly, this program is being recorded, so you can watch it later on the CMA website or our YouTube channel. If you want to watch again or share with a friend, just look tomorrow. It will be uploaded. Now, I would like to welcome Bill Griswold, the director of the Cleveland Museum of Art, who will introduce today's program. Bill?
Thank you, Andrew. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon to hear this year's Dr. John and Helen Collis lecture on Sinai's legendary monastery of St. Catherine. This lecture is made possible through the Dr. John and Helen Collis Family Endowment Fund, and we are deeply grateful to the entire Collis family for their visionary support of the generation and dissemination of new scholarship for the benefit of the public as well as for that of the field. It is thanks to their generosity that each year we are able to bring to Cleveland an outstanding scholar in the fields of ancient Greek or Byzantine art. Indeed, it was in 2015 that Seth Pevnik, who was then curator of Greek and Roman art at the Tampa Museum of Art, visited Cleveland so that he might deliver that year's Collis lecture, in which he spoke of the far-reaching impact of the god Poseidon on Greek myth, cult, and daily life. And 4 years later, Seth became curator of Greek and Roman art here in Cleveland, assured of a warm reception as a consequence of the friends that he had made during that trip. That we might not otherwise have met Seth is just one testament to the magnitude of the Collis' legacy, not just here, but throughout Cleveland. As some of you know, John Collis passed away about 1 year ago in November of 2020. He will always be with us in spirit, however. Beloved by all those at the museum who had the privilege to meet and get to know him, John was, with his wife Helen, a generous, longtime supporter of this institution. Their generosity and their passion for Greek art and culture are manifest not only in the fund that they established to support this important annual lecture, but also in the Dr. John and Helen Collis Family Gallery, which is dedicated to works of art from ancient Greece. I've known very few people who've touched more lives than John Collis. I've referred to his support for the museum, but he was, by profession, a surgeon, indeed, the first neurosurgeon in this country to specialize exclusively in spinal care. And he will be forever remembered as a pioneer, an innovator, a caregiver to countless patients, a teacher, a great family man, and an active member of the Greek Orthodox Church. It seems only right that on the occasion of an event in which he took such pleasure, we should hear from some of his colleagues and friends. And so there follows a video in which those who knew him reflect on his generosity and vision. And then after that tribute, Gerhard Lutz, Robert P. Bergman, Curator of Medieval Art here at the Cleveland Museum of Art, will introduce today's speaker, Maria Vassilaki. Thank you.
Dr. John Collis, a patriarch of the community, was a generous patron to the museum. John's visionary gift established a legacy spotlighting his personal heritage and passion for art and life. For this and so much more, we extend our enduring love to John and his entire family.
Dr. Collis, in my opinion, was a gentleman surgeon. He was an expert in his field, extremely energetic, hardworking, and generous. I gleaned an awful lot in the 15 years that I knew him, and I'm very blessed to have had that opportunity. I think in a simple word, he could be described as a mentor.
He proved to be not only a great benefactor and a patron of the church, but a good friend. Our friendship lasted until his passing just last year. But it was a friendship that was based on mutual respect and admiration. We will miss him greatly, but we admired him, and we truly wondered how is it possible that he could have done as much as he did for the thousands of people that he served and ministered to in his long life as a physician.
John and I go back many, many years, and I have always held him in high esteem, admiration, and respect. One of the greatest characteristics of John was his humility. Whatever he did in a silent manner. It took years before I finally learned what a successful, prominent surgeon and physician he was. He never talked about his personal accomplishments, which were so great and helped so many people. Whether he taught in his local parish Sunday school, or whether he served on the highest boards with the Archbishop and other dedicated faithful stewards. He lived his life through his church and his family, and he was a living example of what we all should be today.
The lecture is a reflection of the intellectual curiosity of John Collis, his love of people, his belief in continued learning, and his deep interest in Greek culture. I was immediately struck by John's personal warmth, his devotion to family and church, his pride in his Greek heritage, and his desire to provide a lasting gift that would honor that heritage. I also discovered that he was an excellent conversationalist and a skilled storyteller. He was a generous and giving man.
He began his practice in 1963 after completing a residency at the Cleveland Clinic and went on to become a pioneer in the spine field. He treated more than 400,000 patients and performed 17,000 surgeries throughout his career. He is considered by many of his peers as a pioneer and innovator who revolutionized the field of spinal care. I will always remember Dr. Collis. My life is better for having had him in it.
It is a special honor for me now to introduce Maria Vassilaki. As a moderator, it is tempting to start off with a well-known phrase in the case of a renowned scholar, but an introduction of the speaker is not really necessary due to her prominence. That is certainly true, maybe especially in this case, since Maria has actually delivered a Collis lecture once before, when she spoke in 2012 on From Byzantium to El Greco, Icon Painting in Venetian Crete, focusing among other things on the CMA's important Cretan icon showing the Virgin and Child. But you still want to do the speaker and her achievements some justice in a few introductory words without turning them into a never-ending list. So how can we briefly summarize the most important aspects of Maria's work? First, there is her role as a teacher. Maria Vassilaki is Professor Emerita in Byzantine art history at the University of Thessaly in Greece, and at the same time a member of the Benaki Museum Board of Trustees. This shows her continuous engagement in academia, scholarship, and museum work, which characterizes her whole work. At the same time, her international activities should not go unmentioned. She's been a fellow at Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C. and at Princeton University, and she curated several major exhibitions, such as Byzantium 330 to 1453, which was shown at the Royal Academy of Arts in London in 2008-09. Her research and publications focus on the study of late Byzantine painting, and especially on icons as author as well as editor. Altogether, I have found over 40 essays and 6 books by her, but I'm sure this is not complete. I will mention only one forthcoming book publication today. Maria is currently co-editing with Charles Barber the book The Icon, From Late Antiquity to the Present, to be published by Cambridge University Press. Her presentation today focuses on one of the most fascinating monastic institutions of Christianity, viewing St. Catherine's Monastery at Sinai. Maria, we are looking forward to your presentation.
I'm deeply honored to be giving the John and Helen Collis Lecture for 2021 at the Cleveland Museum of Art. I first met John and Helen Collis in 2012 when I came to Cleveland to give the Collis Lecture of that year. The Cleveland Museum of Art had just acquired a 15th century Cretan icon of the Virgin of Tenderness, and this gave me the occasion to focus on this icon and to speak about the art of icon painting in Venetian Crete. The lecture of 2012 was given in person, and this provided me with the opportunity to meet with John and Collis and their wonderful family. I have the best memories from that visit. Sadly, John is no longer with us, but his spirit definitely is. My lecture is dedicated to his memory. Today, I'm taking you to the southern part of the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. Sinai, associated as it is with well-known events narrated in the Old Testament in the book of Exodus, became the ultimate holy place, a locus sanctus as it is usually called. It was at the foot of Mount Sinai that Moses saw the burning bush and heard the voice of God asking him to remove his sandals while he was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law. It was also at Sinai that God appeared to Moses and delivered the tablets of the law to him. A fortified monastery dedicated to the Virgin was built by the Emperor Justinian in the mid-6th century at the foot of Mount Sinai on the site of the burning bush. The monastery's main church, the so-called Catholicon, has preserved many of its mid-6th century features. The mosaic of the Transfiguration in the sanctuary apse is the most spectacular among them. The mosaics were conserved and restored by the Centro di Conservazione Archeologica of Rome under the direction of Roberto Nardi and Chiara Zizzola. This process lasted for more than 10 years and came to an end in December 2016. This is how the mosaics in the sanctuary apse look like today. On the tympanum above the sanctuary conch, with the mosaic of the Transfiguration, there is on the left side a scene with Moses before the burning bush, and on the right, a scene with Moses receiving the tablets of the law. These mosaics also date to the mid-6th century. Sinai, already an Old Testament locus sanctus, also became the repository of St. Catherine's body. After the saint was decapitated in Alexandria, her body was transported by angels and buried at Sinai. We can't be certain when the relics of the saint were discovered at the top of the mountain named after her. Once discovered, they were transferred to the monastery's main church and placed in a marble sarcophagus on the south side of the sanctuary, where they started miraculously to exude oil. The translation of St. Catherine's relics from Sinai to Rouen in Normandy between 1030 and 1060 gives a terminus for the discovery of the saint's relics. The earliest reference to the veneration of St. Catherine at Sinai is to be found in the Typikon that Simeon, the abbot of Sinai, drew up in 1214. It is somewhere around that time that we should also place the change in the dedication of the monastery from the Virgin to St. Catherine. According to the Typikon, which regulated the liturgical services at the monastery, the saint's feast day was held on 24 November. At Sinai, both the landscape and the monastery stand for the holiness of the place and therefore become inseparable. This lecture will investigate how and when the Sinai landscape was visually upgraded from being a mere background for the Old Testament events which took place there to an independent composition. In the mid-6th century mosaics on the tympanum above the sanctuary conch, with Moses before the burning bush and Moses receiving the tablets of the law, the emphasis is entirely on Moses. Mount Sinai is treated in a very schematic and generalized way. In icons dating between the 10th and the early 13th century, the landscape is given even less prominence. In the first icon, dating to the 10th century, Moses is standing before the burning bush while taking his sandals off. In the second, dating to the late 12th, early 13th century, the two events, Moses before the burning bush and receiving the tablets of the law, are fused into a single event. The Sinai landscape becomes minimal. The central panel of a triptych surviving at Sinai, which is divided into two registers, shows on the upper register Moses standing before the burning bush on the left side, Moses untying his sandals in the middle, and Moses receiving the tablets of the law on the right side. On the left wing of the triptych, also divided into two registers, St. John the Baptist and St. James are depicted, while on the right wing we see St. Andrew and St. Anthony. This triptych can be attributed on iconographic and stylistic grounds to the Cretan painter Andreas Ritsos and is therefore dated to the second half of the 15th century. In this triptych, the landscape of Sinai takes the shape of three mountainous peaks, which correspond to the actual landscape of the monastery. Mount Horeb, or Mount Moses, stands in the middle. The Mount of St. Catherine is on the right, and the Mount of St. Episteme is on the left. My aim today is to investigate the role played by Cretan icon painters in establishing themes of Sinaitic iconography with a special emphasis on the Sinai landscape. I first want to look at the circumstances that prepare the ground for Cretan icon painters to produce an impressive number of icons and triptychs for the Monastery of Sinai. The Monastery of Sinai maintained a strong connection with Crete because it owned a large number of properties on the island: villages, vineyards, mills, and churches. These were of such importance to Sinai that as soon as the Venetians arrived in Crete in 1210, the abbot of Sinai, Simeon, appealed to the Doge in Venice to confirm Sinai's ownership of these properties. In March 1212, the Doge of Venice, Pietro Ziani, issued an order guaranteeing Sinai's rights over their properties in Crete and granting the monastery immunity from various kinds of export duties. One of the most prestigious dependencies of Sinai in Crete was its metochion in Candia, which was the capital city of Venetian Crete. It is the modern-day Heraklion. This included a church dedicated to St. Catherine, built in 1555, which has survived and houses a very important icon collection. The decree of 1212 clearly illustrates, on the one hand, the wish of Venice to retain close and amicable relations with the Sinai monastery, and on the other, how important the dependencies in Crete were to the monastery at Sinai. The close connection between Sinai and Crete is reflected in the number of Cretan icons produced for the monastery. In fact, an impressive number of icons and triptychs are to be found everywhere in the monastery. Some of these works bear the signature of well-known Cretan painters. This icon, with St. John the Theologian dictating the text of his Gospel to his disciple Prochoros in front of a cave, is the work of the painter Angelos, who was active in Candia in the second quarter of the 15th century. The painter's original signature on the lower right side of the composition was overpainted in the late 18th century. At least 7 other icons in the monastery are either signed by or attributed to the painter Angelos. On the screen, you see an icon of the deity signed by Angelos, and an icon of the Holy Trinity, the Virgin and St. John the Baptist, which is attributed to the painter Angelos. According to Angelos's will, composed in 1436, the painter had a close relationship with the Sinaitic metochion of Candia, to which he bequeathed a sum of money and, on certain conditions, a part of his immovable property. He also bequeathed to the Sinaitic metochion of Candia a tondo icon of St. Catherine, which was to be displayed every year on the saint's feast day in commemoration of himself. The actual icon has not survived or has not yet been located, but a similar tondo icon of St. Catherine, once in Skradin, Croatia, and today in the Episcopal Palace in Šibenik, can be attributed to Angelos on iconographic and stylistic grounds. It seems that Angelos was not the only 15th century Cretan painter who had relations with Sinai. In fact, Andreas Ritsos and his son Nikolaos were also associated with the monastery. We have already attributed to Andreas Ritsos the triptych with the 2 Sinaitic scenes in its central panel. This triptych is standing today on the altar of the chapel of St. James in the northeast of the monastery's main church and just before the entrance to the chapel of the burning bush. Andreas Ritsos can also be associated with other triptychs of Sinaitic iconography, such as this one with the burial of St. Catherine on the right wing of its front side, and Moses untying his sandals and standing before the burning bush on the right wing of its rear side. Both the signature by Victor the Cretan on the left wing and the date Alpha He Ni Alpha, which is 1651, were added in the 18th century. On a third triptych, which can also be attributed to Andreas Ritsos, the right wing of its rear side is divided into two horizontal zones. The upper zone shows Moses before the burning bush, untying his sandals and receiving the tablets of the law. The lower one shows the burial of St. Catherine. Once again, the signature of a much later Cretan painter, Michail Damaskinos, was added in the 18th century. In all these examples, the Sinai landscape has taken the shape of the three mountainous peaks which correspond to the actual landscape of the monastery. Mount Horeb, or Mount Moses, in the middle, the Mount of St. Catherine on the right side, and the Mount of St. Episteme on the left. In these triptychs, two new iconographic variations for the Virgin of the Burning Bush made their appearance. In the first, which is on the left, the bust of the Virgin with the Christ child in a mandorla is reminiscent of the Virgin Platitera. In the second, on the right, the Virgin and the Christ child are shown full length, seated in a mandorla of heavenly light in the center of a green bush surrounded by bright red flames. On one of my visits to Sinai, I came across a rather unusual piece of work, a polyptych in the form of a pentaptych with minute dimensions. Each of its panels measures just 7.6 centimeters in height, something like this, and 5.4 centimeters in width, something like this. One wing of the polyptych is missing. 12 gospel scenes from the so-called Dodecaorton are to be found on the pentaptych's wings. The front side of the central panel shows the Nativity of Christ, while the wings show the presentation of Christ to the temple, the Annunciation, the entry into Jerusalem and the crucifixion, the Ascension of Christ, the Pentecost, the doubting of Thomas, and the dormition of the Virgin. On the rear side of the central panel, there is a representation of the three mountains of the Sinai landscape, and this makes this work important for our discussion today. The view of Mount Sinai remains visible when the pentaptych is closed, and this adds further importance to its representation. In this pentaptych, the landscape takes the form of a triple-peaked complex, placed against a blue background rather than a golden one, which is more typical in such a work. It is obvious that the landscape dominates the composition, while the sacred events are by comparison miniature in scale. In the middle is Mount Moses, with Moses receiving the tablets of the law. Lower down and to the left is Moses before the burning bush. On the peak to the right, which is the Mount of St. Catherine, there is the translation of St. Catherine's body by angels from Alexandria and its burial at Sinai. There is also an oasis with trees in a narrow valley to the right. It's not clear where the monastery of St. Catherine was also included in this representation, but it most probably wasn't. The polyptych's iconography and style suggest that it was painted in Venetian Crete in the last decades of the 15th century. Furthermore, its miniature-like quality makes it highly possible that it was painted by Nikolaos Ritsos, the son of Andreas Ritsos. Nikolaos was active in Venetian Crete in the last decades of the 15th century. There is only one icon known to bear the signature of this painter. It is in the Icon Museum of the Old Orthodox Church in Sarajevo, Bosnia. The icon shows the deities in the middle, the dodecaton scene and single saints on the border. An inscription on the Sarajevo icon gives the name of the painter, Nikolaos Ritsos, and also pays tribute to his father. It reads, "Here Nikolaou Ritzou, ios του Maestru Andreu," meaning the hand of Nikolaos Ritsos, son of the master Andreas. The polyptych becomes even more important if it is associated with a contract drawn up by the Cretan notary Georgio Koumno and signed on 11 September 1499 in Candia by the painter Nikolaos Ritsos and Gerasimos Kypreos, a monk in the Sinaitic Metochion of Candia. The contract concerned 24 works in the form of icons, panagiaria, and triptychs, presumably painted by Nikolaos Ritsos himself and most probably by his father Andreas too. A panagiarion, which owes its name to that of the Virgin, Panagia in Greek, is a small liturgical pattern with a representation of the Virgin and is intended to carry the bread offered to the Virgin by monks during the liturgy. All these works, according to the contract, were in the possession of the monk Gerasimos Kypreos, who was about to travel from Crete to Mount Sinai and wanted Nikolaos Ritsos to safeguard them for as long as he was away. In the event of Kypreos' death, the painter was to deliver each of these works to monasteries in the Aegean, such as the monastery of St. John the Theologian on the island of Patmos, the Dodecanese in the monastery of St. Anthony on the island of Rhodes, the Ionian Islands in the monastery in Strophades near Zakynthos, to Mount Athos in the monastery of Dionysiou, and most importantly, to Sinai. In fact, 17 works were to be delivered to St. Catherine's Monastery at Sinai. The contract makes it clear that all these works had to be handed over in person to the monk Klimis or to the monk Yannis Griparis, both of them monks at Sinai. It is reasonable to suggest that all 17 works ended up at Sinai and that the Pentateuch was among them. This contract, though not a commission for Nikolaos Ritsos, makes it clear that the Sinaitic Metochion in Candia was commissioning works from Cretan painters in large numbers. It seems Cretan painters such as Andreas and Nikolaos Ritsos had established a series of Sinaitic themes to meet the monastery's demands. The representation of Mount Sinai on the Pentateuch, attributed to Nikolaos Ritsos, is of particular interest as it constitutes the oldest surviving representation of the view of Mount Sinai in Cretan icon painting, in which the landscape becomes an independent composition. This seems to suggest that already by the end of the 15th century, representations of Mount Sinai in the form of drawings or prints from woodcuts were circulating in Venetian Crete. A very telling example is the print from a woodcut based on an on-site sketch by Erhard Roivig, a painter from Utrecht, who had accompanied Bernard of Breidenbach on his journey to the Holy Land and Sinai in 1483. The travel book by Bernard of Breidenbach, illustrated with woodcuts of Roivig, was first published in Latin in 1486 and became so popular that between 1486 and 1522 it was reprinted 12 times and was also translated into German, Dutch, French, and Spanish. It is this view of Mount Sinai that also appears on the central panel of the rear side of a triptych the so-called Modena triptych, which is to be found in the Galleria Estense in Modena. It bears the signature of Dominicus Theotokopoulos, that is El Greco, here Dominikou, meaning hand of Dominicus. The Modena triptych is dated between 1566 and 1569, depending on whether it was painted while Theotokopoulos was still in Crete in 1566 or after his arrival in Venice in 1567 to 1568. The Sinai landscape, as it appears on the central rear panel of Theotokopoulos' Modena triptych, shows parallel with that in the Pentateuch. Of course, we have to take into account that we are comparing two works of completely different dimensions. As already mentioned, the dimensions of each of the Pentateuch's panels are 7.6 centimeters in height and 5.4 centimeters in width. The dimensions of the rear panel with the Sinai landscape on the Modena triptych are 37 by 23.8 centimeters, which means that it's about 5 times larger than the Pentateuch's panel, both in height and in width. In the Modena triptych, the 3 peaks of Sinai are placed diagonally, and the monastery is placed at the foot of the central mountain, Mount Moses. A caravan of travelers approaches the monastery from the right and is welcomed by Sinai fathers. A second group of pilgrims approaches from the far left. An inscription on the upper part of the Modena triptych, written in gold letters, reads «Το Άγιον και Θεοβάδιστον όρος των Συναίων», meaning «the holy and gold-trodden Mount Sinai», making reference to Mount Sinai alone and not to the monastery of St. Catherine. It seems reasonable to suppose that the depiction of the Sinai landscape on the Pentateuch probably reflects a larger work, presumably also executed by the Ritsos workshop. All this suggests that well before copper-plate engravings of the Sinai landscape were printed and circulated in the last decades of the 16th century, there were representations of Sinai in the form of perhaps drawings or woodcut prints, which were available to Cretan painters at least in the final decades of the 15th century. In this case, Dominicus Theotokopoulos would have been aware of such representations of Sinai even before he left Crete. His view of Mount Sinai would not therefore have been entirely dependent on the copperplate engraving by Giovanni Battista Fontana, printed in Venice in 1569. Fontana's engraving was based on a description which was presumably a drawing by the Franciscan bishop Bonifacio Stefani. El Greco was to paint the view of Mount Sinai once again on a panel housed today in the Historical Museum of Crete in Heraklion. This is believed to be the panel mentioned on the 31st of January of the year 1600 in the inventory of Fulvio Orsini, the librarian of Cardinal Alessandro Farnese in Rome. The panel was to be bequeathed to Cardinal Odoardo Farnese. In the inventory of Fulvio Orsini, the panel is described as having a walnut frame with a landscape of Mount Sinai painted by the hand of a Greek disciple of Titian. Quadro corniciate di noce con un paese del Monte Sinai di mano d'un Greco scolare di Tiziano. Though the panel does not bear the painter's signature, its attribution to Dominicus Theotokopoulos has been generally accepted. It is known that Theotokopoulos lived in the palace of Alessandro Farnese in Rome between the years 1570 and 1572. In these years, it is believed that the panel with the view of Mount Sinai was painted. The composition shows the Sinai landscape, the monastery of St. Catherine, and small-scale scenes of pilgrims. In the left corner of the foreground, 3 Western pilgrims wearing short capes and hats are approaching. On the right side of the foreground, 3 pilgrims are arriving on camels, while a 4th one has descended from a cross and is kissing the hand of a Sinai monk who is welcoming him to the monastery. Mount Moses is in the middle, scattered with small chapel, and also includes the staircase that leads up to its peak, which survives to this day. The fortified monastery has been placed diagonally at the foot of Mount Moses. There is no doubt that El Greco's composition relies heavily on Fontana's copperplate engraving, which, as already mentioned, was printed in Venice in 1569. El Greco was not the only Cretan painter who depicted the view of Sinai during the second half of the 16th century. The Cretan painter Georgios Klontzas, a contemporary of El Greco, also painted the view of Mount Sinai and of the monastery in 2 triptychs, both of which bear his signature. The first one, known as the Yorkshire triptych, is today in the collection of Mariana Latsis in Athens. The view of Mount Sinai is on the reverse of the central panel. The 3 mountainous peaks are pulled back towards the background in order to leave more space for the inclusion of the monastery, of scenes from the everyday life of the Sinite monks, and of Old Testament scenes. For the depiction of the monastery, Klontzas adopted an imaginary architectural representation with a high bell tower and a wing with an arched 2-story portico in the background. The landscape is full of scenes of monastic life and also of the Old Testament scenes, such as the crossing of the Red Sea in the foreground and the worship of the golden calf. The second triptych by Georgios Klontzas, known as the Spada triptych, also shows the view of Mount Sinai on the reverse of its central panel. Once again, the 3 mountainous peaks are pulled back towards the background, offering most of the surface to scenes of monastic life and to the Old Testament scenes of the crossing of the Red Sea and the worship of the golden calf. 2 dismembered triptychs, the first of which once belonged to the Wilfred Blunt collection in England, and the second to the James Jervis collection, also include representations of Mount Sinai. The first triptych is today in the Mariana Latsis collection in Athens, and the second in the Yale University Art Gallery. The view of Mount Sinai in the Latsis triptych is very close to that of El Greco in the Modena triptych. The view of Mount Sinai in the Yale University Art Gallery triptych is different. The painter moved the monastery and the burning bush to the left, at the foot of the Mount of St. Epistemi, and not at the foot of Mount Moses, where it should be. Pilgrims with camels are approaching from the left and are welcomed by Sinite monks. From the Old Testament scenes, the worship of the golden calf has moved to the center of the foreground, and the crossing of the Red Sea is on the right side of the foreground. It's been suggested that the Athens and the Yale triptychs could be the work of the same painter who was active in the second half of the 16th century. A Cretan triptych in the Vatican Art Gallery dating to the first half of the 17th century shows the view of Mount Sinai on the left wing of its front side. It repeats the composition of the Sinai landscape as it appears in El Greco's Modena triptych, but in a simpler and more compressed way. In the second half of the 17th century, the Cretan painter Victor introduced the Sinai landscape carved on the upper part of the central panel of his triptychs, two of which are still preserved in the Sinai Monastery. This is the central panel of one of these triptychs, showing an image of the enthroned Christ as the great archpriest, flanked by St. John Chrysostom on the left side and St. Basil on the right. On the upper part of the triptych is the view of Mount Sinai carved on the wood. The Cretan triptychs with Sinaitic scenes that are preserved in the monastery of St. Catherine to this day were most probably commissioned by the monastery itself, or were commissioned by individuals and offered to the monastery on the occasion of their pilgrimage to Sinai. The document of 1499 mentioned above in relation to the Pentateuch attributed to Nicolaus Rizos can easily support the hypothesis of works commissioned by or for the monastery at Sinai. The impressive number of Cretan icons and triptychs with Sinaitic themes may imply that some of these representations were made in situ. In other words, was it possible that some Cretan painters established themselves at Sinai? No matter how appealing such a hypothesis appears to be, I find it hard to accept it without enough supporting evidence. It has been suggested, for example, that Georgios Klontzas traveled to Sinai for the execution of the wall decoration on the eastern wall of the old refectory, showing the hospitality of Abraham and the Last Judgment. Iconographically and stylistically, these frescoes cannot be the work of Klontzas. I strongly believe that hardly any Cretan painters traveled to Sinai. This view is reinforced by cases such as that of the Cretan painter Jeremias Palamas, who was active in the first half of the 17th century. Palamas was a monk in the Sinaitic Metochion of Candia and had his icon worship in Acandia too. In 1612, the monastery in Sinai ordered in Candia a wooden iconostasis for the monastery's main church, which Jeremias Palamas was commissioned to gild and also to paint all of its icons. We know that Palamas executed the commission in Candia, and the iconostasis, together with its icons, were transported to Sinai. This wooden iconostasis stands in the monastery's main church to this day, and you can see it on this slide. The only Cretan painter who is documented to have traveled to Sinai around 1775, after an invitation from the Cretan abbot of the monastery, Archbishop Kyrillos II, is Ioannis Kornaros. During his stay at the monastery, Kornaros executed paintings such as the view of Mount Sinai and the monastery for the back of the abbot's wooden throne inside the main church in 1778. Moreover, Kornaros overpainted a large number of icons and triptychs, adding on many occasions arbitrarily the names of Cretan painters with inaccurate dates. This has caused enormous problems in identifying who painted and what and when, and it will take a long time before we are certain about this. This lecture tried to show the role played by Cretan painters in establishing themes of Sinaitic iconography. Moreover, it tried to show the role of Cretan painters in establishing the view of Sinai and turning it into an independent composition. What I find really interesting is the fact that the depictions of the view of Mount Sinai as it appears in the Pentateuch attributed to Nikolaos Ritsos, in the Modena triptych by Dominikos Theotokopoulos, in the Plant triptych today in the Mariana Latzis collection, and in the Vatican triptych, all seem to have made use of a similar prototype. As we are absolutely certain that the Pentateuch and the Plant and the Vatican triptychs were executed in Crete, it's beyond any doubt that their painters had access to this prototype while living and working in Crete. So, please allow me to conclude with some questions. Could this also be used as evidence for the painter of the Modena triptych? In other words, could Dominikos Theotokopoulos have painted the Modena triptych while he was still living and working in Crete? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. I'm not sure whether I'm live at the moment, but I should be. And thank you very much for a very, very fascinating insight into the connections between Mount Sinai Monastery and going over the Mediterranean to Central Europe. And I'm sure there are many questions from the audience, and where already during your lectures something came in, and I'm not trying to scroll and find these questions. So the first question came in. Oh, that's a little bit tricky because it always goes to the end. The first question was, is the painter Angelos the same painter as Angelos Akotantos in the CMA collection from our large icon we acquired about 10 years ago?
May I speak? Can I speak now? Hello? Yes. Yes, it's the same person. And actually, the icon that the CMA acquired, I think around 2010, has been attributed to Angelos Akotantos, and I think there is every reason to believe that he could have painted by this painter. Yes, it is the same painter. That's the answer.
Yeah, and the second question is someone called AZ and referring to the Yorkshire triptych. The question is, does the growing presence of the landscape over the figures in this work reflect a change in taste?
A change in taste has to be associated with Venetian Crete, because Cretan painters had to execute works for both Cretans and Venetians. Venetians of Crete, first of all, who had established themselves in Crete after 1210. And, the Venetian occupation of Crete lasted for more than 4 centuries. Venetians arrived in Crete in 1210 and left in 1669 when the island was captured by the Ottoman Turks. So they stayed for a very long time. And it's obvious that when you have to paint for a Venetian, you produce a work which has strong Western features, both in iconography and in style, but also this is more complicated than we believe, because on many occasions we have icons or triptychs, or mainly triptychs and icons, which were destined for an Orthodox client, but also they had Western features. So it's this is an issue that we very much like to discuss, and it's it goes on and on and on. So you are right that the Yorkshire triptych has some strong Western features.
There's a question from John Merlis. Interesting to hear about the connection to Croatia. Sibernik, where is the Cretan icon in the city, but this is portable, whereas presumably the tondo is fixed. How did it get where? Church?
What we also, the good thing about painting in Venetian Crete is that we have um, so many documents speaking about the conditions of icon painting in Crete that that we can be certain about some things. So what we are certain about is that Cretan icons became so popular that were exported to Dalmatia, to the Dalmatian coast, to Italy, of course, and on some occasions they could go as far as Flanders. So it's for somebody who works on Cretan icons. It's not. I don't take it by surprise that the Cretan icon found its way in Croatia or in Bosnia, or and they have actually. I have colleagues who are working on these Cretan icons, colleagues from Croatia, colleagues from Serbia, and we know it's really fascinating to see how many icons found their way in those places from Crete to there.
Mm-hmm. And there's one more question from Mark Whitmore. The Madaba map image of Sinai looks very different from the images from these icons. Are the three mountains representing the Holy Trinity? I guess that was the
Okay, so if I heard you well, Gerhard, the person who is asking the question is asking about the Madaba map, which is a very early thing. Now we are we are much later, and the three peaks. If one of you has gone to Sinai, you definitely remember that when you arrive there, what is very characteristic are these huge mountains. One in the middle, Mount Moses or Horeb, as it is called, the Mount of St. Catherine, because St. Catherine was buried there, to the right, as we see, and to the left is the Mount of St. Episteme. So of course, one could say this represents the Holy Trinity, but it existed there even before Christianity, even before, so it was there. But it's nice to hear that one can find the reference to the Holy Trinity, a holy monastery built.
Mm-hmm. And
Yes.
so we have about 1.5 minutes left. So I would like to give a few final remarks, and so I would like to hand over now the floor to you.
To me. Okay. I'm afraid we don't have time for more questions because I would love to answer more questions, but I cannot. But what I really want to thank, coming to the end of this lecture, I want to thank the Monastery of Sinai, and especially the Abbot of Sinai, Archbishop Damianos, the librarian, Father Justin, and the secretary of the monastery, Nikolaos Triandafilou, who have offered all their hospitality and generosity during my visits to the monastery, because obviously it took a long time to understand the place, to understand the landscape, to work on the landscape, and of course to look at pieces, icons, and triptychs, most of which are unpublished. So I feel so lucky that I was given this privilege, and I want to thank them publicly from that. And of course, coming to the end, I would like to thank the Cleveland Museum of Art and all the people who made this lecture possible and made it happen. And so I would like to mention these names. So I start from the director, Bill Griswold, Gerhard Lutz, my colleague, and Seth Pevnik, who initially started this discussion about this lecture, Andrew Capetta, Haley Ketziora. Maybe I don't pronounce the names very well. I'm sorry. Jeff Judge, who worked on my PowerPoint and on everything and made it happen. Daniel Noel, Annalise Oden, and Colleen Russell Christ. So thank you. And of course, to thank all the people who found the time on here is the evening of Sunday. I mean, now is 10 o'clock in the evening. So I know that some of my colleagues and my friends had already registered to attend. And of course, people from all over the world. And that's the good thing. I'm very sorry not to have traveled to Cleveland this time. I did travel, as I mentioned, in 2012. This time I could not. But maybe people that won't be able to hear this lecture could hear me tonight. So thank you, everybody, and have a nice day. Thank you.